Game balance is a tricky thing, I suppose. Sometimes something in a game is a bit too strong and it dominates the general matchmaking. Sometimes a thing is too weak and you tend not to see it anywhere. It can be all over the place, and this definitely isn't genre-specific. However, in fighting games, this balance can usually result in a select few characters being way more popular. And when the latest balance patch comes rolling in, adjustments can be made to alter how often we see a character in competitive play. In extreme circumstances, certain nerfs apply to characters that not only make them weaker, but it tanks their pick rate and appearances in tournament, and that is what today's video is all about. Now, don't get the title of this video confused. It isn't about the most nerfed characters, because that has a chance to be factually incorrect, unless I just go over a decade of patch notes and simply list the characters who received the most nerfs in a game of numbers. This video is to highlight characters who received specific changes that made enough of a difference to drastically lower their tournament appearances, for one reason or another. My name is Ketchup, and these are 5 characters in NRS history who received devastating nerfs that dramatically lowered their tournament appearance. If you like this video, why not subscribe? It only takes a second, but the support goes a very long way. Number 5 is Kano in Mortal Kombat 9. How about that? We're already starting off with a curveball. I imagine you didn't expect to see him here, but there is actually a good reason for it, and in my opinion, there's an interesting story to tell. Looking through old patch notes in a game like this is a bit of a nightmare. Frame data isn't really mentioned at all, and to be fair, most of the scene didn't really know what frame data was back then, so I guess it makes sense. However, the year of 2011 saw roughly 4 balance patches. Those that would roll in with each of the 4 DLC characters. They released one at a time, similar to what's happening now with the Combat Pack of Mortal Kombat 1. Kano was not a character on anybody's radar to be good. In fact, he was, in the entire game's lifespan, always considered low tier. But in the early days, he was actually really annoying to fight, mostly online, and that is because his upwards Kano ball was significantly harder to punish. When you blocked his upwards Kano ball, it was really hard to punish. I don't have exact frame data for you because back then nobody really knew what frame data was, and community member Sombreness hadn't put together a frame data thread on Test Your Might for the character at the time, and remember that this was a very early period in the game. The short of it is, this move was either very hard to punish, or most characters lacked a reliable option. This certainly wasn't helped by the fact that people played the game mostly online with delay-based netcode, so punishing a tight move is even harder than it should have been. In one of those balance patches, it was stated that this upwards Kano ball would have its recovery adjusted. The example given was that it was more in line with a Johnny Cage flip kick. In short, it's easier to punish. Now that doesn't sound like much on paper, but what this did was take the one good move that Kano had and made it way more unsafe. Now, we have the power of hindsight years later, and taking a character who was already low tier and removing safety on the one decent special he had pretty much delivered a huge blow to the character, and it straight up eliminated any chance Kano would have in any matchup the Kano ball helped him out in. Yes, it was annoying, and yes, most Kano players back then built their game plan around knife toss at range and up ball up close, but it was genuinely all the character had, and without this, it sealed his fate as a bottom tier character that would never see competitive play. One thing to note is that in this patch, his forward 3, which we all know now as a low attack, was adjusted to be a low. This move used to hit mid for some reason. Now that was a nice change overall, but the nerf of Kano Ball was bad enough to remove any chance he had of being good in even a couple of matchups. One nerf would cement this character as bottom tier for the entire competitive journey. Number 4 is Deadshot in Injustice 2. Haha! Just the name probably sends shivers down the spine of some viewers. Look, if you hated zoning or you hated keep away in general, Deadshot was the worst enemy of any competitive fighting game. He was unbelievably good at keeping the opponent away from him. There were tons of ways to fire at the opponent at all kinds of different angles. Although was never really considered a high damage character, he had tons of ranged utility that would simply add up over time. This character was a complete menace in the first year of competitive Injustice 2, and most players seem to have a pocket Deadshot by the end of his reign of terror for certain matchups, and some characters really struggled to get even close to him. Now, that's not to say even at his greatest he wasn't without flaws. He did lose to some characters, but the amount of characters he did super well against kind of countered that weakness in general. He was possibly the most hated competitive character I have ever seen in NetherRealm competition, and I've been around since it began. Everyone hated this character, so it was heavily expected that one day he would receive some significant nerfs, and that day came. In November of 2017, many of his main keep-away tools received significant gameplay changes. There was significant meter gain reduction when using wrist cannon and rifle-based special moves. Basically all of them. There was increased combo damage scaling with his charging knee attack. His straightforward projectile had noticeably slower startup, on top of more recovery if the projectile missed. The ability to clash his rifle special when he meter burns it, that was now given. It used to be unclashable, and this patch changed that. For those unaware of Injustice, a clash is this game's version of a combo breaker. Once those nerfs rolled around, his use in tournament absolutely tanked. He went from being a super common character to being rarely seen at all. His bad matchups got worse, and his good matchups became slightly more manageable for the losing side. Not to say he still didn't do well versus some of the popular characters. Some players said he did well versus Starfire or Dr. Fate, two characters that were very common even by the end of the game. But overall, this character was considered nerfed to the point of almost irrelevancy. His player base seemed to vanish overnight, and those that liked to zone with Deadshot would simply learn a new character that could do the job better. A huge collection of nerfs, but none that were unexpected. The community opinion on this character was so poor that everyone pretty much waited for this to happen. But for some, the damage had already been done for the game, where Deadshot, at his prime, single-handedly killed some people's enjoyment of the game, never to return. Number 3 is Triborg in Mortal Kombat X, more specifically Cyrax and Cyber Sub-Zero. Now, Triborg is genuinely one of the sickest character designs of all time in Mortal Kombat. It's the perfect character in a game with variations. Simply take a universal robot design, give the variations to the cyborgs who didn't make the roster day one, and you have a decent character. It is absolutely 4 characters in one here, so I am sorry if you think I'm kind of cheating, but the universal idea of Triborg is relevant to this video. Triborg on launch was seen as a possible top-tier contender across all 4 variations. The amount of cool stuff that every variation had was through the roof early, and all of it seemed incredibly strong. From character to character, the entire community was kind of focusing on their one favorite variation and just going in to find as much crazy tech and combos and whatever else they could get their hands on. The future of this character seemed bright during the game's prime time, however, this would be short-lived. There would be one balance patch not long after Triborg released. It was March of 2016 that delivered possibly the highest amount of nerfs a single character has ever received in a single blow. The patch notes may as well have had an entire page just dedicated to Triborg. There was that many. But the thing is, the heaviest nerfs delivered were definitely to Cyrax and Cyber Sub-Zero. Their combo scaling was drastically lowered. Universal plus frames on knockdowns would hurt them the most. The free situations they had before that would force you into a guessing game would be altered or removed completely. Cyber Sub had way more damage scaling if you used a dive kick or a drone. The universal changes to buttons and strings hindered the potential even further. Cyrax would have more instances where net would misfire. Less moves can be used in general, on top of giant damage scaling in combos. two variations that had really good utility because of damage and setup, and the two things they were doing better than Sector and Smoke. They would take the largest hit in this patch, and over the course of competitive MKX, would simply see Sector and Smoke charge on ahead as way more common and generally seen as more useful. It is a shame that even to this day, two variations got nerfed the way they did. I mean, they're not terrible by any stretch, and people using these variations now can do some pretty wild things in online tournaments and exhibitions, but in the game's prime time, this one patch made people use Cyber Sub-Zero and Cyrax significantly less, which is why you rarely saw either of them in the Pro League or the various offline major events. Number 2 is Geras in Mortal Kombat 11. The character who made his debut in this game was extremely popular in the early days. In fact, throughout most of the first year, we saw this character by many players who had so many tools that worked well in the game's meta. Practical crushing blows, tons of which being tied to counter hits, which was often the most practical way of getting them. Big damage, some cool setup and situations thanks to the Gauntlet of Ages ability. The short of it is that Geras was a very dangerous character, right? And he did a lot of things well, whether it was counter-zoning thanks to Sand Trap, an extremely good backwards movement, rushdown potential thanks to his good buttons. He had super good wake-up options because of his flawless block or wake-up up 2, which was 6 frames on launch. He was really good, is the point I'm making. That said, over the course of the game's life, he would, in many patches, constantly receive either large or small changes that over time would somewhat alter how the character was optimally played. The first patch people remember came in August of 2019, which primarily changed how his crushing blows worked. He had a lot of them tied to counter hits originally, which was super dangerous because of the combo breaker system in the game being breakaway. It only worked if someone was launched, so if they're on the ground, you can't break anything. So his advancing mid counter hit, unbreakable. His Sand Trap counter hit was unbreakable. Huge damage for a single hit that you could do nothing to avoid if it hit you. These would be changed to have different requirements that, while still worked, were not as on the spot as how they used to be. Other changes included recovery frames on strings, different startup speeds to some of those strings, changes that would actually alter his combo game and force Geras players to do different combos instead. He would receive a nerf to his up 2 from wake up or flawless block. It became 9 frames instead of 6, losing what used to be a really good, although frustrating to fight, defensive option. There were nerfs to his down 1 on block and on recovery. He wasn't always majorly changed, but it seemed like most patches would somewhat weaken Geras in some way or another. These changes added up, and although some of these changes were arguably beneficial to him, depending on who you spoke to, Geras would eventually somehow become more of a specialist pick that we almost never saw in tournament anymore. A character going from extremely popular to not very popular at all, a character who had to be played a bit differently to his day 1 version, is very much an example that belongs in today's list. And finally, the character you've probably been waiting for, it's time to talk about Scorpion in Injustice Gods Among Us. Scorpion in the first Injustice was actually the very first guest character to the series. Fitting, I'm sure, because it was made by the Mortal Kombat team, but Scorpion had one of the most interesting stories. In my opinion, it's a situation that's never happened since, so let's talk about it. Scorpion on launch was an absolute nightmare. This character was so silly and, to many, seen as absolutely broken. A safe wake-up attack, huge hitboxes on jump-ins that were overheads, and thanks to a side-swapping teleport, forced a scary, hard-to-react-to and block situation. There was less recovery on teleport, much larger jump-ins for instant overheads you can't react to, and so much more that ultimately led to a character who somewhat broke the rules of the game. And when Scorpion first came out, he was scary to fight, either offline or online. And online had delay netcode, so that wasn't any fun. And this kind of Scorpion, while strong, was short-lived. We only saw this version of the character in one tournament, and that was CEO 2013. Half of the top 8 was Scorpion, and as I've explained in an older video, the whole list of strengths for this character was perfectly put forward. That being said, after CEO, a balance patch would hit the shelves, and this patch would give Scorpion a ton of major nerfs. Nerfs to almost his entire kit, in fact. There's almost too many to mention because they all existed to nerf his safety, his recovery, his hitboxes, his damage. The entire kit of Scorpion was nerfed. But not just nerfed, absolutely gutted. And it had some rather disastrous side effects. Not to mention, there was a bug for a bit that existed where his damage was incorrectly scaling too much. There was a time where he had 20% combos, and that's no good. Scorpion would become a shell of his former self. Everything you wanted to do from a mix-up point of things was way harder and less rewarding. He's way more unsafe, he does way less damage, he has to spend more resources on stuff. Everything was colossally worse, and when I say disastrous side effects, what I mean is, Scorpion in this patch became the worst character in the game. Never in the history of NetherRealm has a character gone from number 1 to bottom 1 in a single patch. Scorpion made history here by having an extremely short-lived reign of terror swiftly undone by a patch so gigantic he became the worst character in the game, and not a single player ever wanted to use him after that. From broken to irrelevant, Scorpion in Injustice Gods Among Us has the record of the most nerfed character of all time. And that is our list of characters that received game-changing nerfs for competitive play, altering their pick rate in tournament. Thank you all so much for watching. Stick around for plenty more MK where that came from, and I will see you next time. Take care.